want to jump right in, but just a little bit of background. So I'm drawing on evidence from this forthcoming book, which is due out in Europe in June. But just to clarify, what I'm talking about in terms of what a pelvic exam is, because it's very, I don't know in the Belgian context. Most of the research I did for this book is the US and the UK and a few parts of Europe. But just to clarify what a pelvic exam is, in the US context, it consists of three parts. An examination of external genitalia, first of all, and second, a speculum exam, typically accompanied by a pap smear to test for cervical cancer. And then thirdly, a bimanual exam, meaning inserting one or two fingers into the vagina while pressing on the abdomen with the other hand in order to evaluate the patient's pelvic organs. Okay, so just so you understand the context here. But what I want to do is start with a quick pelvic performance. So this is just about a 2-minute clip from a television show which premiered in the United States in 2007. This is a pilot episode of Mad Men, and the scene you're about to see takes place in a gynecologist's office. This is Peggy Olson, who is a young woman from Brooklyn, New York, who is starting a new job as an advertising executive secretary at an advertising firm. And on the first day of her job, the office manager named Joan Harris makes an appointment for Peggy with a gynecologist. Now, why would she do this for her job? Because Peggy is a Girl Friday. She's someone who's expected to be sexually available to clients prepared for sex in this new climate of sexual liberation. So it was filmed in 2007, but the scene and the story, the plot takes place in the year 1960, right? So looking backward in time. So I'm just going to play this quick scene. I want you to just pay attention in the interaction between Peggy and this gynecologist.
So, you must be Peggy Olson. Joan Holloway sent you over. She's a great girl. How is Joan?
She sends her regards.
She's a lot of fun. Must be a scream to work with her.
Yes, it's pretty terrific.
Mm-hmm. Try to make yourself comfortable. Relax. Okay. I see from your chart and your finger that you're not married.
That's right.
And yet you're interested in the contraceptive pills.
Well, I was...
No reason to be nervous. Joan sent you to me because I'm not here to judge you. There's nothing wrong with a woman being practical about the possibility of sexual activity. Spread your knees.
That's good to hear.
Although, as a doctor, I would like to think that putting a woman in this situation is not going to turn her into some kind of strumpet. Slide your fanny toward me. I'm not going to bite. I'll warn you now. I will take you off this medicine if you abuse it. It's for your own good, really. But the fact is, even in our modern times, easy women don't find husbands.
I understand, Dr. Emerson. I really am a very responsible person.
Oh, I'm sure you're not that kind of girl. Now, Joan, I'm just kidding along here. You can get dressed. I'm going to write you a prescription for Enovid. They're $11 a month, but don't think you have to go out and become the town pump just to get your money's worth. Excuse my French.
Okay. Oh, stop. I don't want to do that. Okay. So as I said, that's the pilot episode. And a couple of things I just want to draw attention to while she's waiting for the gynecologist to enter, we see her looking at the following manual that says, "It's your wedding night, what every bride should know, how to be a good wife." And I'm going to allude to this later on in the talk, so I just wanted to draw your attention to that. We know, of course, that's not why Peggy is at the gynecologist, but we are shown this scene. Then the gynecologist walks in, he proceeds to do this examination. A few things that are interesting. Of course, he's male because it's 1960, and in the US, 93% of all gynecologists were male in 1960, in fact, up to 1970. He's smoking. That's a little more outdated now. And he's condescending and judgmental. So this rang true with a lot of women in this time period. Notice also that when he inserts the speculum, the camera pans to her face, and then she turns and looks at this picture on the calendar. So we get a sense of the intense discomfort that she's experiencing during this, and then the clink of that metal speculum at the end. Now, the scene is only 2 minutes long, but it brilliantly captures all of the contradictions of 1960s America when it comes to sexuality. The emergence of the birth control pill, supposedly marking the beginning of sexual liberation. And Peggy, a character who could have come straight out of Helen Gurley Brown's Sex and the Single Girl, who is free to do what she wants as long as it includes pleasing men, and yet she's still chastised for doing it, right, by this gynecologist. She's still treated like a child and warned to behave herself. Now, Peggy is there for one simple reason: to get access to birth control. So she endures the speculum. She has no choice. There's no discussion of why she has to have a pelvic exam, no discussion of a pap smear or when she might get the results of this. This is purely a transactional event, if an unpleasant one. But it's also no longer the case. For about 30 years in the United States, beginning in 1960, a trip to the gynecologist was nearly synonymous with getting the pill, or at least the main reason many visited the gynecologist. So by 1973, for example, there were roughly 10 million American women on the pill. This, of course, requires 10 million visits to the gynecologist. But by the 1990s, it was becoming clearer that more and more sexually active women were putting off a trip to the gynecologist due to the shame and fear of getting a pelvic exam. And this, in turn, was leading to unintended pregnancies. It was also clear that that pelvic exams and pap smears were unnecessary requirements for obtaining oral contraceptives. So organizations across the globe changed their recommendations, such as the World Health Organization, who in 1994 stated that a pelvic exam was no longer necessary for safe use of oral contraceptives. And then the Food and Drug Administration, the USAID, Planned Parenthood, the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, they all follow suit with this recommendation. So if it's unnecessary and studies show that women are avoiding it, why make it a requirement? And furthermore, if that's the case, should we just get rid of pelvic exams? Are they necessary at all? Can we do away with them? Well, this became a real subject of debate. So in 2014, the American College of Physicians recommended against performing screening pelvic exams altogether in asymptomatic, non-pregnant adult women. Why did they do this? They stressed the direct harms in studies based on these multiple studies linking the exam to either pain and discomfort or fear, embarrassment, and anxiety. Now, the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists was more reluctant to reverse this decision. They were stressing the benefits. That screening pelvic examinations in the context of a well-woman visit may allow the gynecologist to explain a patient's anatomy, reassure her of normalcy, and answer her specific questions, thus establishing open communication between the patient and her care provider. So they recommended that the gynecologists and other providers should counsel patients about the benefits, harms, and lack of data, and then they should decide together whether or not the pelvic should be performed. So not surprisingly, this discrepancy as to whether it's needed, when it's needed, for what purpose, has contributed to some confusion. In a 2017 study, for example, 1/2 of patients surveyed could not answer the question, do you know why this examination is performed, right after having the exam. Half of those surveyed could not answer that question. But largely absent in this debate is why there is so much fear or shame or stigma attached to the pelvic exam, or what can be done about it. What is it about the exam that makes it so terrifying? I think it is in part a larger social and political problem about language and stigma about the female body, which in turn has led to some horrific accounts of abuse, which I will get to toward the end of my talk. I'm sort of outlining the process by which that abuse could occur. So I want to start, though, with two quick and recent examples from the United States about this stigma or silencing about the female body. The first comes from 2012, when Michigan State Representative Lisa Brown was banned from speaking in the House because she used the term vagina in a debate over an anti-abortion bill, a term which her Republican colleague found offensive. So in response to this gag order, Lisa Brown and her fellow congresswomen uttered the word more than 100 times on the state capitol steps in Lansing while performing the vagina monologues. And she says, I question if you think there's something wrong with the word vagina, what word would you like me to use instead? She said, I'm not going to be all cutesy or Little Women about it by giving it a silly name. The second example comes from this controversy, the controversy surrounding the image you see before you. This image is from the 2017 Women's March. In 2020, in celebration of the centennial of women's suffrage in the US, the National Archives developed an exhibit, and at the very front of it was this picture, but it was life-size. And a journalist noticed that the archives had intentionally blurred out certain terms, certain words on these posters that the protesters are holding. So any references to vagina, pussy, et cetera, get wiped out. The irony, of course, is this is the National Archives. They're supposed to preserve historical material, not blur it out, not mess with it. I was interviewed by that journalist in the Washington Post, and that led to an invitation for me to speak live on this story on CNN. And what I was struck by as I went on live television was when Frederica Whitfield starts questioning me, I realized I didn't know if I was allowed to use those terms on national television, right? So it continued that kind of like, what language are we allowed to use and why? Yes, they also blurred critical images of Trump, but I was brought there to talk about the vagina reference. Okay, so those are just two really quick examples, but why do they matter? What I'm suggesting here is the shaming of the reproductive anatomy by being unable to speak about it takes a toll on all women who have picked up the cue that they too should remain silent about their bodies. So, for example, in a 2014 survey in the UK, they found that a majority of UK women between the ages of 16 and 25 have a problem using the term vagina or vulva. And then further, the discomfort also results in a basic lack of anatomical knowledge. Only half of women aged 25 to 36 surveyed could accurately identify parts of the vagina on a very simple diagram. And then finally, the implications of this: nearly 1/3 of younger women admitted they avoided going to the gynecologist altogether due to shame or embarrassment. So I hope you can see that kind of the impact, that process by which the outcome is avoiding the gynecologist. And this continues to be a problem. In 2022, 16 million women in the UK were eligible for a pap smear test, but only 11 million showed up for one, and that was the lowest in a decade. So it seems to be getting worse. So what I want to focus on today is the question, as a historian, where does this come from? Why this discomfort, anxiety, and fear, suggesting some kind of blurred boundaries between what's sexual and what's medical, which in turn leads to, as I'll get to, sexual misconduct. So not surprisingly, I'm going to argue that this is not a new problem. The stigma is nothing new. The stigma is present from the very start of the development of the pelvic exam. So what I'm going to do today is briefly trace this issue across 3 periods of gynecology. And again, I'm focusing here on the United States to argue that the meaning and purpose of the pelvic exam was linked to 3 things. First, how gynecology defines itself as a field in a particular time, concurrent attitudes about sexuality, and then what kind of new technology is emerging at that time to bring these 3 together. And I'm doing this again to underscore the ways in which that stigma kind of runs rampant in the ideas behind how to do a pelvic exam, okay? So bear with me, I'm going to do these 3 little moments, and I'm going to start in the 19th century, which is really the origins of the development of gynecology and this new tool, the speculum. So this is a really obviously important moment in the history of medicine, that the origins of gynecology and more generally the professionalization of medicine is closely linked to the development of the modern speculum. And this is really a revolutionary moment because, you know, for centuries, women's bodies had remained a mystery. Medieval Christian moral laws prohibited physicians from physically examining women as the female body was shrouded in secrecy and in shame. And while the male sex organs were visible, the uterus remained a mystery. In the 16th century, Flemish anatomist Andreas Vesalius became the first to capture what a uterus actually looked like, publishing his drawings of dissected corpses. And yes, I realize that is not a uterus you're looking at, but this is kind of the standard types of images he would use. They were primarily male. Why is this? Because most of the cadavers that are available for dissection were executed criminals who were primarily men. Several of the women that Vesalius dissected were sex workers, allegedly, one of whom ended up on the title page of his 1543 volume on the fabric of the human body. The woman had claimed to be pregnant, possibly to avoid execution, but after midwives examined her and declared she was not, she was hanged. The woodcut that captured her dissection, as you see here, exposed not only her naked body, but her reproductive organs, as Vesalius is depicted drawing back the skin and pointing to her uterus amidst a crowd of gawking men who are kind of looking on in this scene. So now back into the 19th century, it was the unique position of the United States, and in particular, the role of slavery that would enable the medical gaze to position itself even deeper into the recesses of the female body. And by the 19th century, into the bodies of living women, largely thanks to gynecologist James Marion Sims, inventor of the Sims speculum. Yet the enslaved women who did the most to further the science of gynecology had even less power than those of the Renaissance sex workers whose crimes transformed them into anatomical subjects. So this transformative moment allegedly occurred when physician James Marion Sims figured out on his own how to suddenly peer into a woman's vagina. Introducing the bent handle of the spoon, I saw everything as no man had ever seen before, he proclaimed in his memoir, which in turn then gave him the idea of the speculum. Now, this is not quite true. He was not the first to do this, but the claim struck. the claim stuck. He was given credit as the father of American gynecology and used his Sims speculum to develop gynecological procedures on the bodies of enslaved women. Now, he was specifically interested in repairing vesico-vaginal fistulas, an opening between the bladder and the wall of the vagina, usually caused by protracted labor and childbirth. And he would spend nearly 4 years and do countless surgeries on a handful of enslaved women before finally repairing a fistula. And this was often done in front of an audience of other male physicians. But this discovery went well beyond simply repairing a fistula. Here was a tool that, in the words of his colleague, quote, caused the name of Sims to flash over the medical world like a meteor in the night. The speculum threw an abundance of light into the vagina and the womb, enabling the exposure to what had previously been hidden from view. The speculum has been to diseases of the womb what the telescope is to astronomy, his colleague claimed. And Sims himself agreed, noting, quote, I felt sure that I was on the eve of one of the greatest discoveries of the day, he claimed. And though he doesn't really deserve the credit, in some ways he was right, because as I mentioned, the modern speculum came hand in hand with the professionalization of medicine in the mid-19th century and the establishment of gynecology as a legitimate field. It also enabled medical men to distinguish themselves from female midwives who did not use the tool and to enter what had previously been a female space of healing. However, and this is important, Sims made it perfectly clear that he was not in any way enthused at the thought of peering into women's vaginas, stating, if there was anything I hated, it was investigating the organs of the pelvis, in his memoir. Now, why would he say this? Sims was a fan of P.T. Barnum of Barnum and Bailey Circus fame, and was himself a master showman. And I'm fairly certain this was part of his act, because for many people, they were appalled at the idea that medicine would legitimize peering into vaginas. The very thing that made the speculum revolutionary, exposure, was also what made it controversial. In the context of Victorian morality, this was scandalous and would blur the boundary between medicine and sexuality or pornography. And just, note the physician's gaze in this case is nowhere near. He's not looking. Everything is with his hands, with touch, and she's fully clothed. So obviously, gynecologists in favor of this had work to do to try to promote it. And many were opposed. So here's just one example by a Dr. Carter, who says, I have more than once seen young unmarried women of the middle classes of society reduced by the constant use of the speculum to the mental and moral condition of prostitutes, asking every medical practitioner under whose care they fell to institute an examination of the sexual organs. Now, many people, when I read this quote, kind of either laugh or look in horror at the idea that anyone could find a pelvic exam sexually stimulating. But this is the concern on the part of some, that this is really inappropriate and it will lead to this kind of blurring of boundaries. Now, notice that Carter makes a reference to prostitutes in this quote, and that was not a random reference. In fact, in the same period in Paris, prostitution was legal but regulated by authorities, and female sex workers were required to register and be examined with a speculum. What I found really striking about this was the examinations were publicly witnessed by medical students and visitors from foreign countries, so that many doctors became familiar with the use of the speculum while studying medicine in Paris, and then they returned home in the 1830s and 40s and began to use on their own patients. So there's a direct kind of underscoring of the sexuality involved in this procedure, right? Also, just the emphasis on that this is a public viewing, that these sex workers were literally exposed to whoever wanted to be in the room, Just as if we think back to Vesalius, this idea of a public gaze looking on female body parts as being part of it. And that it's either sex workers or the enslaved that are used as the model upon which to build a practice, right, which would then be expanded to the white middle class. So for these reasons, those who favored the speculum in these debates among practitioners had to tread very carefully. How did one convince a respectable white middle class woman that a speculum was necessary, or that it was necessary to peer into a woman's body? One way was to link it to pregnancy and childbirth. The speculum, like other gynecological instruments such as forceps, was a way to differentiate medical men from midwives. And this is a part of a larger transition in childbirth, especially in the US. So here's one example that I want to read that I hope you find as disturbing as I do. So this is from a obstetrical manual published in 1895, in which Dr. A.F.A. King, professor of obstetrics, noted that a vaginal exam, while rarely needed, was necessary to determine whether a woman was in labor. So King is offering guidance to the young practitioner who may experience some embarrassment with his first vaginal examination. And so he stresses it was not necessary to obtain verbal consent of the patient before instituting the examination. Proceed without hesitation as if consent had already been obtained. Do not worry about explaining your actions. The less said, the better. Proceed without hesitation, just as in feeling the pulse. And now should the woman cry or declare she cannot submit, he continued, proceed just the same. Only physical resistance should induce the physician to give up the examination, but this will seldom occur. So the message here to anybody reading this manual is consent is not necessary. It's the physician's right and duty to penetrate a vagina, just as it would be to take a pulse. Okay. At the end of the talk, I'm going to come back to this controversy about consent, specifically on patients under anesthesia in medical schools, but I just wanted to draw your attention to this and to underscore that there's an acknowledgement from the start that the boundaries between medicine and sexuality were dangerously blurred, that consent is not necessary, and note here also that the concern appears to be primarily on that of the patient, not the gynecologist. Either she was a prostitute that needed to be regulated, or a middle-class woman that could be sexually stimulated by the exam. Okay, I'm now going to jump forward into the mid-20th century. When we see a shift in kind of the meaning and practice of gynecology from more focused on pathology or surgery to preventive gynecology. In the 20th century, especially after the introduction of the pap smear, pelvic exams became the norm, and the current concern switches from inappropriately stimulating a woman to addressing frigidity, especially influenced by Freudian theories about female sexuality. So in 1955, A. Claire Siddall greeted his colleagues at the 4th annual meeting of the American Academy of Obstetrics and Gynecology with what he believed to be good news for the field. There are unmistakable signs that a new frontier of preventive medicine is developing in the private practice of gynecology, he says. And the keystone in this new arch is the annual health inventory, and the chief emphasis is on pelvic cancer detection in presumably well women. Now, Siddall was one of the first doctors in the United States to use the pap smear test for the detection of cervical cancer in private practice. Within a decade of Siddall's pronouncement of this new frontier, approximately 48% of all American women had received at least one smear test. Though I should add, most of these were white women. Only approximately 1 in 5 Black women had had a pap smear. by 1963. Perhaps more significantly, now I do want to emphasize, of course, that this was a life-saving technique. This was a positive development in the field of gynecology, but alongside that, the development of the Pap smear justified the need for this recommended annual health inventory or yearly checkup. For too long, Siddall believed, the field of gynecology had emphasized curative medicine. In other words, gynecologists only treated those who were sick or pregnant. And the problem with this approach was, in Siddall's mind, that the patient assumes the responsibility for when she needs the gynecologist. And that left too much power in the hands of the patient, who could decide for herself when to seek treatment. And according to one gynecologist, many women did not like to be seen going to a gynecologist's office because it means either you are going to have a baby or you have female trouble. So the stigma of consulting a gynecologist, therefore, further constrained a gynecologist's access to a readily available patient base. So even prior to the 1940s, really only a tiny fraction of women had regular checkups with a gynecologist. So here's where it gets interesting. An influential branch of mid-century gynecology adopted what they called psychosomatic gynecology, relying heavily on Freudian theory in their approach to gynecology. As they explain in this textbook, in gynecology, more than any other specialty, the combination of disease with sexual problems requires an understanding of the psychology, which was developed by Freud and his students, they write. And then continuing, it is known that a great number of patients who come to the office with gynecological complaints actually have no demonstrable organic disease. Quite often, it is a way of indicating anxiety, fear, resentment, or guilt in the use of this part of the body. Why? Because of all the connotations which are associated with the genitals. Now, I highlighted those terms, anxiety, fear, resentment, or guilt, just to underscore. Back in the beginning of my talk, I mentioned this, the concern among the American College of Physicians, who changed their recommendation in 2014 because of these terms, anxiety, fear, resentment, or guilt. So it's this long-standing concern about the experiences with the gynecologist, and in this case, also with sexuality. So where is this anxiety, fear, resentment, or guilt coming from? In the 19th century, the concern was it was coming from the speculum, potentially, which would either wound their modesty or sexually stimulate them. But by the mid-20th century, the concern is not with the speculum. Any guesses? The concern, if this is within Freudian context, it's the mothers. Many mothers tell their daughters that sexual relationships are degrading, improper, shameful, or dangerous. The mother or aunt or friend trains the young girl to feel it is sinful to have sexual desires. Such teaching leaves a stigma with the girl, which may greatly influence her sexual behavior. It is not unexpected if such a girl develops and retains a feeling of repulsion or disgust towards sexual activity, right? So because of the mother, the daughter experiences frigidity. So it's up to the gynecologist to rectify this situation. It is very important that the wife shall be completely satisfied sexually. If and when she is, she becomes relaxed and productive in other activities. We see all kinds of neuroses due to nervous irritability caused by sexual frustration. So I promised I would come back to this. This is that image of Peggy holding the brochure. Premarital pelvic exams become very common in the 1950s and 60s in order to ensure that young brides were ready for their wedding night. Okay, so that we see the gynecologist taking on this role of marriage counselor here to try to improve the situation and to ensure that white middle-class women stay not only sexually satisfied, but have many children. So a kind of a eugenic notion there as well. So here's a final example from a textbook about how and why this works. They know we had a patient recently who was examined soon after marriage and presented a very thin hymenal ring, but a pronounced vaginal spasm. So just to clarify, it's a thin hymenal ring, so she shouldn't be experiencing pain, and yet she's having these spasms. But when she was relaxed by discussion of her problem in a sympathetic manner, the vaginal spasm disappeared and a medium speculum was inserted. This was in the office, and during the discussion, she admitted that she had been taught by her mother for many years that intercourse was base and indecent. It was obvious that she had come to fear the sexual function very much. Marriage in itself could hardly change this deep-seated pattern overnight. Although the marriage contract gave her and her husband permission to proceed, she was psychologically unable to permit the man to enter. But the gynecologist could do that, right? Guiding young women through the mechanics of sex to ensure marital stability, gynecologists established their position as moral arbiters during the post-war era. But by doing so, of course, they underscore this link between the pelvic examination and sexual practice. Even though, and so just to clarify, right, in the examples I gave you from the 19th century, there's this recognition of the potential to blur sex and medicine and to make efforts to ensure that that did not occur, to really differentiate. Now we're talking about the 1950s with the introduction of the Pap smear, even though this is a technology used for cancer detection, not for sexual activity. This is before the discovery of the HPV link and the idea that it was a sexually transmitted disease. So that was not understood. So the technology is about Pap smears, but it's the smear that justifies the routine annual exam and that establishes the doctor-patient relationship on Freudian terms, which by 1960 will be required for the prescription of the hormonal birth control pill. So they all become clumped together until the 1990s, right? So we have this kind of clear blurring of these boundaries as a result of this transition. Okay, final example, and that is gynecology under siege with the feminist movement in the 1970s. So in the 1970s, health feminists turned this theory of Freudian, and the mother blaming on its head, arguing that the pain and shame and anxiety experienced in the doctor's office was not in their heads, nor a result of bad mothering or sexual repression, but by poor sexist treatment. So in other words, it's not the mothers, it's the gynecologists. And that this was inherently captured in the performance itself, the pelvic performance. As Ellen Frankfurt put in the early on, the beginning of her book, Vaginal Politics, I was naked, he was dressed. I was lying down, he was standing up. I was quiet, he was giving the orders, right? It's sort of emblematic of the whole procedure, okay? The problem, according to Frankfurt and others, was the fact that 93% of all OBGYNs in 1970 were male. And according to most, sort of the kind of image you saw in the Mad Men episode, kind of dismissive. So one solution was to bring more women into medicine. Quotas are finally starting to be eliminated in medical schools, but increasing numbers of female students did not immediately transform medical education or training. Many of these female medical students face harassment and ridicule when they enter the medical school, and this problem becomes publicized by Harvard Medical School's first female dean, who publishes this expose called "Why Would a Girl Go Into Medicine?" a scathing attack on the treatment of women in U.S. medical schools in 1973. And she had surveyed 146 women who had attending 41 medical schools, and goes on to describe the men's club atmosphere apparent in the laugh-getting comments and pictures about female sexuality that female students described being subjected to. One woman complained of hearing men make remarks to the effect that the gynecological exam must be titillating to perform. Now, these attitudes were also captured in the popular press. Playboy magazine frequently highlighted female nurses, for example, as Playboy centerfolds, along with cartoons that sexualized the doctor-patient relationship, as these two I'm showing you here. This one, now to test your reflexes, the doctor says, or here, gosh, I hardly know where to begin. So these images, which come out of Playboy magazine, were juxtaposed by news stories suggesting that male doctors actually did engage in some of these scenarios. Playboy highlights this with a piece from the American Journal of Psychiatry, which found that about 5% of physicians had had sexual intercourse with some of their patients, and a further 8% said they occasionally used erotic practices as part of their treatment. Now, this is in Playboy. Do they really think this is a problem? Perhaps not. But health feminists, on the other hand, in the 1970s, draw increasing attention to these problems as pornographic, misogynistic, and demanding reform in medical education and gynecological practice to protect and respect female patients. Other women, other feminists separated entirely from professional organizations to create women-centered, women-controlled feminist health centers, emphasizing this idea of self-help, that all knowledge production should begin with women's experiences. In 1976, there were about 50 of these, and many of which they had no formal medical training, but the idea was anybody could learn on their own bodies. So in this particular example, health feminists are really turning the technology of the speculum on its head, right, as a feminist tool. So in this third phase, gynecology under siege, the technology is self-help, and the pelvic exam has now been charged as something that has been eroticized, something for male pleasure rather than as a screening procedure. So if you take that to its logical endpoint, the only useful exam is self-given. Get rid of the gynecologist altogether. So where are we now? Just to kind of wrap up and move briefly into a discussion of sexual misconduct. If you look at the chart, it's not entirely clear that the move to expose more body parts has been a positive thing. The final, the 2018 photo you see is the Olympic gymnast doctor, Larry Nassar, who I'll talk about in a second. So we're in a state of confusion. On the one hand, there's a recognition that, for example, Sims isn't necessarily a hero. There's been a lot of research and activism around this, including the removal of his statue from Central Park in 2018. On the other hand, the stigma continues. Female pain is still not taken seriously in many instances, and consent is still very much an issue. The problem of the non-consensual pelvic exam, in which physicians and medical students perform pelvic exams on female patients under anesthesia for educational purposes without obtaining explicit consent from patients. It's still a problem. There's greater awareness, but it's still a real talking point. But then finally, I want to end with kind of a staggering series of sex abuse scandals that only heightens the anxieties about whether or not one should seek the guidance of a gynecologist. Now, I'm going to briefly talk about one case, in particular, Nikita Levy, in my last few minutes. I do want to emphasize I'm in no way suggesting that all gynecologists are misogynists or pedophiles, but the fact that these scandals have emerged, I think, and the pattern that we're tracking here makes a disturbing statement about why this is allowed to happen, or why it has. So between 2014 and 2023, hospitals and universities have paid staggering sums to settle sex abuse cases involving physicians, many of whom abuse students, athletes, and patients for decades. In 2014, Nikita Levy, this case against Johns Hopkins, which I'm going to return to, that settlement was $190 million. 2018, the Larry Nassar case, Michigan State University reached a $500 million settlement for the victims of Larry Nassar, the team doctor for USA Gymnastics. 2 years later, Ohio State agreed to pay $46 million to 162 athletes abused by Richard Strauss, a team doctor at the university, for 20 years. In 2021, the University of Southern California set the record with a whopping $1.1 billion settlement for victims of George Tyndall, the only full-time gynecologist at USC's Student Health Clinic for nearly 30 years. Over 300 women had accused Tyndall of mistreatment and sexual abuse dating back to the early 1990s, but no one was listening. In 2022, the University of Michigan announced a settlement of $490 million to over 1,000 victims of Dr. Robert Anderson. Like Tyndall, Anderson worked for nearly 30 years in a university position, serving for a time as the director of the university health centers and an athletic doctor. And then as recently as 2023, so I had to update my PowerPoint to include Haddon. 245 patients of Haddon, a gynecologist employed by Columbia University Medical Center, alleged that they were sexually assaulted by him during gynecological exams. And these numbers could go much higher. This case is still running. Okay, let me turn though to the Levy case briefly. In early 2013, a clinical technician who worked with gynecologist Nikita Levy at Johns Hopkins East Baltimore Medical Center grew increasingly suspicious about the purpose of a pen hanging on a lanyard around the doctor's neck, day in and day out. After working with him for 2 years, she suspected that the pen contained a tiny camera that he was using to take what she believed to be inappropriate photographs of all his patients. She noticed that he often stood up while performing pelvic exams and then pulled the pen down at an angle so that it was directly facing the patient's vagina. She snuck the pen out of the office and took it home, discovering that it did, in fact, have inappropriate videos and photographs. The Baltimore City Police discovered a sophisticated computer network, including multiple computer servers and at least 5 computers filled with patient images and patient digital media. And 10 days later, Levy committed suicide, as did Strauss and possibly Tyndall in my list. Now, it wasn't just photographs. Levy was also charged with conducting unnecessary and unwanted medical tests in order to expose patients' genitalia, conducting pelvic exams without the presence of a chaperone, and inserting his ungloved finger into patients' vaginas. In the aftermath, some patients revealed that when they lay exposed on Dr. Levy's examining table, they were in a state of extreme confusion, shame, and shock about what they experienced. They carried the feeling they were molested. 8,344 of his roughly 12,500 patients over a 25-year period joined a class action lawsuit against the hospital and Levy. Given the stigma surrounding going to a gynecologist, finding a trustworthy doctor is even more important, which is what makes the Nikita Levy case all the more heartbreaking. Many were shocked that the kind-hearted 54-year-old Jamaican-born doctor, a father of 3, could be capable of such a thing, just as many of Larry Nassar's supporters initially felt. Never in 1,000 years would I have imagined such a thing, said a nurse midwife who worked with Levy for years. He was incredibly passionate. He was always there to take care of his patients. They expected him to be on call 24/7, and he was. She noted that he had one of the biggest fan clubs in Baltimore and that he was always busy as he had an extensive patient population. A former patient of his recalled that, quote, he was a more serious version of Dr. Huxtable without the bad sweaters, a reference, ironically, to Bill Cosby's character on The Cosby Show before Cosby's own sex crimes had surfaced. He had the same warmth and humor, she noted. So part of the struggle in making sense of what Levy did and what the hospital managed to miss is that we expect villains to look and act like villains. What does it mean when they don't? How do we protect ourselves when we don't know what to look for? As one patient asked after learning what Levy had done to her, do I need to take a security guard to the gynecologist? Does the person we entrust with our most private parts need to be policed? In this case, the indicators of professionalism and clinical detachment, the white coat, the medical setting, and the technological devices masked the hidden desire, the misuse of the camera to capture for pleasure rather than for treatment. Seeing what was invisible to the human eye with a flashlight and a camera served voyeuristic interests rather than clinical diagnosis. So where do we draw the line when it comes to enabling gynecologists to peer into hidden places without consent? The key question, whether we are talking about Nikita Levy or 19th century gynecologist James Marion Sims, is what happens when technology allows us to look somewhere we've never been able to look before. Whose bodies should be subjected to such a gaze and for what purpose? What power or ability does the owner of that body have to consent? The same procedure, the pelvic exam, that has perfectly legitimate functions and has saved countless lives through its ability to diagnose cancers and other disorders, has a complicated past and an uncertain future. The same is true with many medical procedures and practices, but it's particularly an issue here because of its potential for abuse, which is really, I'm suggesting here, embedded in gynecology's history. It's a routine exam that for the past 2 centuries was primarily crafted and deployed by medical men on bodies that were different from their own. Attitudes about female pain and pleasure could not be checked at the door. Instead, these beliefs were instrumental in the development and professionalization of gynecology. And much of the time, these practices were tested and perfected on the most vulnerable of bodies. The Nikita Levy case and the history I've presented today make it abundantly clear that this is not just a problem of the 19th century. It's a reproductive health crisis right now. Thank you.